NutriCast.
This week on the Deep Leadership Podcast.
CaptiveAire is 48 years old now. And after 48 years, we have a laundry list of things that need to be done. So this idea of a serial entrepreneur, meaning they go from business to business to business, they're never going to achieve the level of perfection that needs to happen within a particular industry.
Hi, and welcome to Deep Leadership. I'm your host, John Rennie. Well, I hope all is well with you today, and I'm so glad you found this podcast. Now, if you've been listening for a long time, I want to thank you for tuning in each week. The success of this podcast is because of your loyal viewership. If you're new, welcome aboard. The purpose of this podcast is to build a world with better bosses, and we do that by introducing you to the greatest minds working in the leadership space. Our guests are authors and academics, podcasters and entrepreneurs, business leaders, military leaders, and successful leadership practitioners in a variety of industries. And our goal is to provide you with practical information to help you along your leadership path, whether you're new to leadership or a seasoned pro. So thank you for listening in. It's an honor to be your host and leadership guide in this journey. Now, today we have another special episode. As many of you know, in addition to running my manufacturing business, Peak Demand, I started teaching business classes at Thales College in Wake Forest, North Carolina. Thales College was founded by an amazing entrepreneur and leader, Bob Luddy. In today's episode, you'll get a chance to hear from Bob on the challenges and successes of starting and building his highly successful company, CaptiveAire, as well as how and why he has founded so many schools like Thales College. This interview was conducted by one of my teaching colleagues, Dr. Josh Herring. Josh runs the Optimistic Curmudgeon podcast, which is fast becoming one of my favorites. Bob is such an interesting and insightful leader that I wanted to feature this interview here on our show as well. I love this interview, and I know you will. So, are you ready to dive in? Let's get started.
Welcome to Deep Leadership. Leadership is a people business. That's the philosophy of your podcast host, John Rennie. As a former Cold War submarine officer who spent 20 plus years leading businesses in corporate America before starting his own manufacturing business, he knows that leadership matters. Are you ready for some real-world actionable advice from John as well as his expert guests?
I'm ready.
The show starts right now.
Welcome to the Optimistic Curmudgeon, where the best ideas win. I'm your host, Josh Herring. Today, my guest is Mr. Bob Luddy, founder and president of CaptiveAire, the world's leading manufacturer of kitchen ventilation equipment, Franklin Academy, St. Thomas More Academy, Thales Academy, and most recently, Thales College. Bob, welcome back to the show.
Hey, Josh, pleasure to be with you today.
I'm so glad you can come over. We haven't done this in, I think, a couple of years, so I was really excited.
It's been a while.
Yeah. Well, today I really wanted to pick your brain about this phrase, the educational entrepreneur. I know it describes a lot of things that you've been a part of over the years, and certainly your work with all the different schools and now the college has everything to do with entrepreneurship and education. I was hoping we could start with just defining the terms. What exactly is an entrepreneur?
To me, an entrepreneur is somebody that endows both people and resources with new capacity and sometimes wealth-producing capabilities. So they essentially empower people through freedom and ideas. Ooh. What an American concept.
So empowering people through freedom and ideas. Can you give us some examples?
In most industries, the vast majority of people, they understand the status quo. I call them mavericks of the status quo. And they embrace the status quo, and they don't want any changes because that's what they've learned. An entrepreneur comes in and looks at it and says, I would do things differently. And if they're correct, potentially they make a very valuable contribution. But it should be pointed out that all ideas are not good ideas, even from very smart people.
I'm sure that's true. I know before the show you were telling me that about kind of the proportion of entrepreneurs. Do you think everyone can be an entrepreneur, or are entrepreneurs kind of the few?
No, I don't think everybody could be an entrepreneur because it takes a certain subset of unique skills, which sometimes are hard to define. Every person has the capacity to be somewhat creative in a free environment. Okay. But they may be creative, an artist, but not a risk taker. They may not want to have the burdens of an entrepreneur, where they're responsible for their dream and the people working for them. So everybody has the capacity to contribute, and an entrepreneur would be nothing without those contributors. But the entrepreneur has to have an idea that's going to work in the future, and it has to be much better than what we're doing now. So sometimes people have an undertaking and they're doing something very similar to right now. It's not likely to succeed because that's already available in the marketplace. So an entrepreneur is moving the marker, hopefully in the right direction. And I think that's the principal contribution. And entrepreneurs actually abhor the status quo because they think they can do something better.
So there's part of that that's got to be inborn in certain people. They just feel an internal desire to change the way things are done.
Absolutely. And it's not in most people. Now, that can be encouraged, it can be supported, but I don't think you can. Sometimes colleges say, we're going to teach you to be an entrepreneur. No such a thing. They may be able to support the education you need to be a good entrepreneur, and they may encourage you, but no one can create an entrepreneur, just like we can't create an artist or any other profession.
Sure, and I think there's definitely, I know some folks who have definitely gained the skills. Let me grab those
Thank
for you. Certainly some folks have gained the skills of an artist, but there is something that makes a true artist has got to be something that comes from within, that's coming out in those places. And it seems like those two things have to coexist, the internal nature and then the skill set.
Yeah, think of Mozart. He was practicing at age 3, but he couldn't possibly be Mozart unless he was pretty close to a genius. Or Michelangelo, we could go through a laundry list of people.
Sure.
They had some enormous talent, but it did have to be nourished.
Well, you took the entrepreneurial mindset in that way and took it first into the business world. I know that led to CaptiveAire being such an incredible success. But then you did something that I don't think very many people do, and you kind of turned over to education as a place to bring this entrepreneurial mindset. What was it about education that drew your attention as a place that could use this sort of disruption?
Well, if you think about this, sometime back we met a group from Richmond, and they said they spent 10 years trying to improve the political environment in Virginia. And I said, what happened after 10 years? And they said, we were a total failure. And even they began to realize the only way we can impact the society and the culture is education. So they're supporting us in Virginia. So I witnessed many young people who could never access the American dream because they were not receiving the education that they needed. And since I was so fortunate in life, I felt compelled to do something about it. And that's kind of the nature of entrepreneurs. They see a problem, they want to do something. They may be wrong, but they want to do something. So I decided to become engaged for the long term in education. And it's paid enormous dividends. We could go back to Ben Franklin, and he said the best investment is education. It completely changes our life, gives the ability to think. We meet new people. We go through Socratic. We find out sometimes we're absolutely wrong.
Every time. And it's always something.
And when that happens, we're growing intellectually, emotionally. We're becoming more valuable to ourselves and to our community. So to me, education is the way you change culture. And if you look back historically over thousands of years, a lot of things went wrong. But something was also going correctly, and that was people were becoming more educated, more sophisticated. They were becoming more moral, even though in our modern world we don't often think that's the case. Relative to 2,000 years ago, yeah, we're very moral.
Sure. Now that's I think when I think about education, I think about some teachers who and I don't want to name names for this point, but I can think of several teachers over the years who seem to become very stuck in their ways. And there is something about schools that they seem to sometimes make maybe an idol of tradition and the way we've always done things. But one thing I always appreciated about Thales Academy and now here at Thales College is that you're very much open to saying, well, I'm actually not interested in even knowing exactly how everyone has always done it. I just want to do it in the most efficient way possible that gets us the best outcome.
If you think about anybody that wants to be really good at what they do, I could spend 6 months on a talk, and then I give the talk, and on the way I'm making changes, and then after I give the talk, I'd say, I think I could have done better than that. So that's kind of the attitude I want to instill. We're always trying to get better, and it's part of the fun of life. I mean, to go from sitting in the back of the classroom and just trying to figure out your way, to being actually go out and make talks and write books and try to influence people in a very positive way. That's what a good citizen does.
Now, you mentioned a minute ago that sometimes as an entrepreneur, things go wrong. Could you tell us about a couple of those moments? And what do you do when some idea that you think is going to go great, it either just doesn't work or it just seems to kind of blow up? Like, what do you do in that moment as an entrepreneur?
Yeah, someone asked me recently, what are the major mistakes you make? It's one, delegating to the wrong person, putting too much confidence in a technology that's not been well vetted. Many times you could have a terrific idea. It may be 10 or 20 years ahead of its time. We even had a case where we had a product that would extract 95% of all the grease in a kitchen ventilation hood. So we thought,
that sounds great.
This is the biggest winner of all time, except it only lasted a half a day. So after lunch, they would have to change their filters. And on a practical level, it just didn't fly. So there's a case where we did have a perfect product, it was well tested, and it completely failed in the marketplace.
So that as an entrepreneur, you've got to not only be attuned to the needs of the market and a potentially workable idea, but also the results. The results matter a lot.
Yeah, how's it going to play on the ground? So people have sometimes amazing ideas that are never going to work out in reality, but they are interesting ideas. And maybe if you think of 2024 versus 2000, the tremendous technological improvement allowed for other improvement in every single industry. So in some respects, CaptiveAire could only advance based on outside technologies that support that advance, particularly electronics, machine tools, communications, all the above.
I think on the Thales Academy side, there's been we've had so many efficiency gains through being able to work the iPad in, being able to use Canvas as the LMS system, being able to centralize some of the some of the back office functions, and all of those are possible through the internet technology and kind of being able to centralize a lot of those things. But otherwise, either each campus would need to do or each teacher would need to do. But instead, we can automate a lot of those processes.
And think about today, how much knowledge you can take in a single week because of the Internet of Things. You can constantly be looking up information. You can put full books on there and read them quickly, highlight them, do book reviews. That was a lot harder. When I went to college, you had to go to the library and hope the book was there. And now we've got menus of books. We have podcasts. So we're exposed to an enormous amount of information. And I think one of the things that entrepreneurs do well is connecting the dots. And I asked an intellectual the other day, what do you think that process is? And he said, you have to take in a lot of knowledge. You have to have a lot of knowledge to connect the dots. So if you limit yourself and you're giving the same presentation you gave 20 years ago, you're not connecting the dots.
It reminds me of one of my favorite passages in Aristotle. And he talks about, this is in... I forget which book, but it's somewhere in one of the books of the Nicomachean Ethics. He talks about the fact that the magnanimous man ought to know a lot or a little bit about a lot of things, and he almost needs to be ashamed of having too much specific knowledge. Alexander the Great, a few years later, talked about how he would be ashamed to have a true expertise in playing music, because that would have cost him so much general knowledge.
Very interesting. You know, essentially, you have just described the nature of a CEO of a company. So they need to have a general knowledge of a wide number of subjects, but they're not the expert in any one of those subjects. But they know enough to be able to pick good people and to understand if the direction's correctly. Whereas, supposing you knew absolutely nothing about finance, and you have a finance director who's not so good, you're in trouble. So essentially, you've described the role of the entrepreneur, learning as much as you can about as many subjects, to be knowledgeable, to make good decisions, and then to pick somebody that's vastly better than you in every one of those categories.
So a lot of the success that you found is really also, it's tied directly to surrounding yourself with the right people.
Oh, absolutely. There's a book called Good to Great, and they talk about getting the right people on the bus. And that's a big part of it. If you have mediocre people, the best you can do is a mediocre outcome. If you have superior people, they tend to continue to get better over time.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
This episode is brought to you by Pharaoh Skincare. I would have never imagined I'd be talking about skincare, but this stuff is truly amazing. Pharaoh is revolutionizing skincare by replacing harmful chemicals with natural ingredients sourced from regenerative farms. Now, weightlifting is tough on the hands, and Pharaoh's Epic Dermis is the best product I've ever used to get my callous hands back to normal and stay in the game. Now I use it every day. Pharaoh also works to reduce fine lines, wrinkles, and improve overall skin health. As Pharaoh CEO Charles Mayfield likes to say, a little Pharaoh goes a long way. Deep Leadership Podcast listeners can save 15% off all of their products by using the code DEEP at checkout. So check them out at pharaoh.life. That's FARROW.life. This episode is brought to you by the Salty Sailor Coffee Company, the official coffee of the Deep Leadership Podcast. Salty Sailor is a veteran-owned coffee brand on a mission to deliver premium, fresh roasted coffee while making a positive impact in the world. Their motto is drink coffee and do good, which reflects their commitment to making amazing coffee and actively supporting the military community. 10% of every order goes to the Navy Marine Corps Relief Society, an organization dedicated to helping sailors, Marines, and their families in times of need. All our listeners get 10% off every order of their amazing coffee by using the discount code DEEP at checkout. So check them out at saltysailorcoffee.com.
Could you tell us about a couple of those people? Names if you want, but if not, leave them anonymous. But tell us about some of the people that you met and what was it about them that made them stand out to you? Like, oh, that's somebody I want on my team.
We had a gentleman come to us in '99 named Bill Griffin from College Park, Maryland, engineer. And after a couple of years, I put him in charge of engineering. And it was a bit of a surprise to him because he's a young engineer, but he had a superior work ethic. He was a very good methodical engineer. He had a vision of the future. And fast forward, here we are 25 years later. He's the president of CaptiveAire Engineering and Manufacturing. And 2/3 of the people at CaptiveAire work for him. So he's not only progressed in engineering, but finance, economics, R&D, managing plants, which is a tremendously difficult job, managing new technologies that make those plants run. So that growth pattern continued throughout his 25 years. So I'll take credit as a good selection there.
Oh, fantastic. Now, I think it's interesting you didn't name, those were not personality traits necessarily. It wasn't as if, like, oh, here's a smooth talker, here is a very charismatic person. Those also aren't things you can see in a single job interview. Those are qualities that it takes a bit of time to be able to see: work ethic and dedication and vision.
One other, we had a gentleman began in 1981, November, Bill Francis, as the chief financial officer. He's still here. Okay, 43 years later. He has a good understanding of finance, of legal and accounting. He gets along with people. So for over 40 years, he's protected us legally. He's made good financial decisions. CaptiveAire has no debt. So there's some people, I think in sports they call them franchise players, that when you detect their talent and understand what their capabilities are, you want to keep them on the team forever.
Well, let's talk about that part about CaptiveAire not having any debt for just a moment, because I have both of my brothers are in different levels of tech sales, and they've given me a slight bit more of insight into kind of the contemporary startup space in technology. And the companies that they work for tend to go take on investors really fast and be kind of floating on top of a bubble of debt. But in the last 2, maybe 3 years, that has just dried up completely, and their companies keep folding. Why did you decide that CaptiveAire was not going to take on debt? I mean, I'm sure there have been times where easy capital could have led to faster expansion or something along those lines.
Yes. Well, since the company was founded with no money, it forced us to be more resourceful. And that resourcefulness still exists today, 48 years later. Companies with venture capital, so if you start off, I recently ran into someone, they started with $12 million venture funding.
Wow.
At the end of 3 years, all $12 million is gone. They're looking for more funding. And I said to him, why would anybody give you more funding? You squandered $12 million and you haven't achieved even level 1 goals. So having too much money makes you a sloppy manager. Think about if you're out and you have $300 in your pocket and you're in college, you can feel pretty heady. You might spend it all, but if you have $5 in your pocket and you think, I got to be really careful. I have to make sure I can get a Uber ride home. So having too much resources is actually a negative, even though it's viewed as a positive. Being underfunded is a positive if you're clever enough to work through the problems. But if you are, it makes you a far superior manager. So I'm totally opposed to this idea of writing massive checks to people. In the government, they call it fully funding. Has that ever resulted in anything good? Absolutely not.
No.
No.
I'm personally kind of hoping that Elon Musk does what he's been joking about doing for months, and that if a Trump administration does happen, that he becomes the director of government efficiency and then just slashes budgets and departments all across the executive branch. But we'll see if that happens.
He's proven it works at X.
No, it's been fascinating to watch, because I mean that's one. I remember people thinking it was a giant joke that he would buy then Twitter, and then that he could even get it to work. But he went in and cut 80% of the force, and then got those 20% actually doing their jobs. And I think he's about ready to turn a profit on X now, if he hasn't already.
Yeah, think about if you had a committee and you'd say, I want to slash 80% of this overnight. The committee would be hemorrhaging, right? They would say, please, we have to counsel. You can't do things like that. So the entrepreneur has some unique skills that don't exist in the marketplace.
Now, I want to go back around to education, because I'm fascinated by the fact that out of all the areas that you could go into, you've chosen education. So why, and not even just for a temporary span. Some people have sort of a faddish obsession with this particular measure or this particular model of school. You've stuck with education as an area for at least 25 years now that you've been deeply invested in. So why so much time and efforts and resources into starting schools?
Well, I think it's the best use of resources, number one. And if you think of any industry, CaptiveAire is 48 years old now. And after 48 years, we have a laundry list of things that need to be done. So this idea of a serial entrepreneur, meaning they go from business to business to business, they're never going to achieve the level of perfection that needs to happen within a particular industry. So you think about education. A friend of mine in Europe wrote a book, a pamphlet, what does it mean to be educated? Very often that question is not asked. What's asked is, do you have a degree? Did you complete your coursework? There's no discussion on what does it mean to be educated. So one of the things that we are now beginning to achieve at Thales Academy and Thales College, what does it mean to be educated? You have to be a good communicator. You have to have good people skills. You have to have a range of technical skills. And you have to be a continuous learner. And many people, as mentioned at your conference earlier this year, 80% of the people after formal education never read a book.
It's terrifying.
This is a shocking number, as opposed to, I try to read or audit at least 50 books a year. I don't read them all word to word, but I get the essence out of them. Some of them aren't worth reading and they get chucked. And And the other thing that came out of your conference was every time you read a new book, you have to read an old book. And sometimes we forget the wisdom of the old books. You don't, because that's your stock and trade. But in the modern world, people think, I'm just modern. I don't need old stuff. And the old books help us understand human nature, which is a big part of the entrepreneurial undertaking.
No, it's so true. That was C.S. Lewis's on the reading of old books, that essay for that conference, and it was such a great principle. Even just say, okay, one for one. He's not even making the true literature professor's argument. You should only read the old books. He didn't think that was true. Lewis thought if you should treat your reading kind of like you treat your diet. You should have a balanced reading diet. And if I'm going to read a contemporary work, then I need to read a classic. And I found that it really is those classics that draw me back to the things that are perennial about human nature. The contemporary books, they're flashes in the pan, they're hit or miss. But if a book can stand the test of time for 100 years, it's usually got something to say that's worth hearing.
Think about a contemporary book. It should be based on the old books and giving you a better explanation of what the old book said. That's how I view them. If they're coming up all these newfangled ideas, they're going to be very ephemeral.
Oh, sure.
To your point.
Oh, speaking of books, though, Bob, I see you brought some with you today. Do you want to talk about any of the books that you brought?
Yeah, I wanted to start with Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl. So Frankl was Jewish, 1938. He stayed in Vienna. In 1942, he was put in the camps. He survived 3 years in the camps, and he lived 50 years longer. And while he was in the camps, he helped many people survive. So if you're going to be an entrepreneur, it's going to be hard. And you're going to wonder why you did it at some point in time. Compare your burden with Frankl's, and it's going to look pretty light compared to Viktor Frankl. So I would start there. And then entrepreneurs need to have an understanding of the natural world, the physical world, physics. They need to understand free market economics, not baloney economics. One of the books I have is an old book, Henry Hazlitt, Economics in One Lesson. But any free market book would be useful.
That one, I had a high school history teacher who he only had one quarter that he was assigned to teach economics, and we read Henry Hazlitt. I still remember the broken window fallacy from that book, because that one keeps coming up. People keep suggesting, look, there's been a crisis. There's, I'm sure someone has made this argument about Western North Carolina over the last few weeks. Look at how many jobs are being created by the need to make all these repairs. And Hazlitt points out what a fallacy in thought that is. And each of his chapters are just they have these rich images, and they communicate really profound truths in a very accessible way.
Virtuous Leadership by Havard. If you're not going to be a virtuous leader, you will not survive. If you're not sure about that, read the Wall Street Journal every day, and you'll get a good lesson. Daniel Goleman on emotional intelligence. So what does an entrepreneur has to get along with people, has to get people working together? That requires a high emotional intelligence. We call it EQ. Freedom and Evolution is written by a friend of mine, Adrian Bijan, who's a famous physicist over at Duke, and he explains the basic concepts of physics. So I'll just point out one. Laws of diminishing return. So if you're a product that's 92% efficient and you're going to try to make it 95% efficient, you're going to be beaten by your competitor because you're wasting your time. So understanding the basic theoretical concept gets applied all day long to your thinking. There's actually people, even within our industry, they're trying to get from 92 to 95. Nobody in the marketplace is even going to know the difference. And if you say, by the way, we increased the efficiency 4%, but the cost by 15%, no thanks. So all of the structural theoretical thinking that you learn in college and you learn by reading books is imperative to entrepreneurs.
Well, let me ask you one quick question about Bijan's book, because I've heard him speak about the concept of flow, and I've heard that idea be kind of in the Thales orbit for a couple of years. I want to see if you can tell me if I'm close to articulating his concept correctly, because I still am not sure if I understand it. But if I understand it correctly, his argument is that in nature, when we look at vast systems tend to find the freest method of movement that is available to them. And if we apply that principle to the design process, we actually will, by allowing the freest amount of movement, we will create the most efficient method of movement, even if it's not a straight line kind of motion. Is that anywhere
That's
close
perfect.
to correct? Okay.
Yeah, the fact that we're moving toward efficiency is important. So the deer goes to the best grass in the safest area. And if it turns out to be perceived to be less safe, they move to a lesser. So it's less efficient but more safe. We as humans are part of this natural world, and we react exactly the same.
One of our seniors here at Thales College, she explained flow for her end of semester symposium talk last semester, and she did it using an example of the different traffic routes to get from her house in Cary to the college in Wake Forest. And suddenly, that her analogy helped me. I was like, oh, I get that. Because she was talking about the way that depending on which way she went, and depending on which way the traffic lights hit, it would either take her 38 minutes or 42 minutes. But she knew to a T.
She would go to the 38.
She would.
Yeah.
She would. And some days she would know that like the 40-minute route might be technically longer, but it would have fewer slowdowns. So she valued the fewer slowdowns, but it was still an application of that flow concept.
If I'm driving from here to Raleigh during high traffic, I always Google, because one route may have an accident. Mm-hmm. I know the fastest route, but it may not at that given time be the fastest route. So it's an example. We want to move toward efficiency at all times. That's innate. We don't have to think about it. We do this thing naturally. So apply that to a college, a K-12, or a business. Somebody thinks, well, I've learned this, and I'm going to do this for the next 30 years. It's in complete defiance of the constructural law, that the world's dynamic, and the world's just moving on past them, and they don't actually even recognize it until it's way too late. Drucker has a comment that he made, and Peter Drucker is another one I highly recommend to read all of his books. But he's got a comment that says, by the time you see it in the financials, the hour is very late.
That makes perfect sense.
It's a beautiful statement. You better be paying attention to what's going on long before it shows up in the numbers.
So the entrepreneur is the one who has this sense that we need to change the status quo. He sees the ways that could change, and he's willing to make a change, and he surrounds himself with the right people that will really help make that change go. And then he's willing to take a risk and try to do something different.
And now I would add to that, you will not be embraced when you want to change the status quo. You will be told you were wrong over and over again. And you may be wrong. So most people, they're mavericks of the status quo, complete defiance of the constructural law.
Well, one of the most helpful chapters in Havard's book is where he talks about the importance of fortitude, I think, for the leader. And he describes the leader as sort of a rock, and the waves of complaints just have to go up against the leader. And if you're a good leader, you can't shut down all the people who are complaining. You might try a little bit, but you have to just kind of be able to take it. Does it work that way for entrepreneurs?
In the early years, I thought of this often, and it comes up today. There's times when all you have left is your persistence. Nothing else is going all that well. If you persist, and if you're determined enough, you will solve those problems. I may add this, a legitimate entrepreneur might set a lofty goal, but they never pretend that they know how to get there. So they're on this journey to reach the goal. That's basically how CaptiveAire works. So someone will say, well, how can you set these goals which seem to be ridiculous? I said, well, it's a marker we put out there. We're working toward the marker. It's not complicated, okay? And it may take longer or shorter period of time than we anticipate.
Well, you did that very effectively for us here at Thales College last year. I remember sitting in a couple of admissions team meetings, and we were you set us a goal of 20 students, and we spent a year working very hard to find the 8 students that came and joined us this year. I don't know if we would have gotten to 8 if we hadn't been aiming for 20, and that goal is a very helpful thing.
It's very important.
Well, Bob, let me ask you, I've just got 2 last questions for you today. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how exactly does what Thales College is doing How does what we're doing here at Thales College help with forming that entrepreneurial mindset? Because we're asking all of our students to study the liberal arts and entrepreneurial business.
Yeah, so we're basically, if you think about people that are ignorant of certain things, they make a bad decision, but then you look and say they're completely ignorant of the knowledge they need to make a better decision. So if an entrepreneur needs the liberal arts, all decisions at CaptiveAire and Thales are made from philosophy. They're not made from data sheets. So people send me their business plan, their data sheets, and it's like, I'm not even interested in looking at these. First, we have to determine if you really have a good idea. Learning from the masters. A friend of mine got an MBA from University of Oklahoma, and the entire MBA was very focused on master entrepreneurs. So in my case, Ken Iverson, who formed Nucor Steel, Ken was a brilliant guy, but he was also well-grounded. He was right down on the ground. And I learned so many things from him about incentives, how to manage people, decentralization. So think if you learned from the 25 best entrepreneurs of our time or even older time, you start picking up how would have they handled that problem. And maybe the problem's different, and maybe it's nuanced, but it's in your collective memory. So whenever I think of things, I reference back to Ken Iverson, to Bill Peterson, who was my mentor of Austrian free market economics. That's all in my head, and that's what we want to do at Thales. We can't make an entrepreneur, but we can provide the skills and knowledge that they will need if they choose to be an entrepreneur.
Well, I think I'll just speak about a couple. I won't name them either, but I'll speak about a couple of our freshmen. We've got some freshmen who are very excited about building their own things, and they came here thinking, okay, this is a college that wants to help me get the skills and knowledge I need, not to necessarily go work for somebody else, but to build my own future, whatever that looks like. And I'm very excited to see what these students go on to do.
That's going to be the future course of Thales College.
I certainly hope so. Well, Bob, just in case any of our viewers today are thinking, gee, I really like this entrepreneurial mindset, what are some practical things I can do to help cultivate this within myself? How can people, in whatever stage of life they're in, how can they kind of cultivate these attitudes that you're describing?
One is learn to be a good calculator. How long does it take to drive from here to downtown Raleigh?
20 minutes,
Yeah.
22, 25.
But you could calculate it in your own mind. And how did I do on that calculation? Or I'm going to go to the grocery store. How much money am I going to spend? So learn how to calculate. Learn how to think through problems in a very deep way. So people tend to be up on the surface. You get way below the surface, and you have to seek knowledge of people around you. Coming up with the right idea for entrepreneurs, I always say it's mostly right in front of you if you can recognize it. So I was out installing fire suppression system in kitchen hoods. Pretty soon I'm installing kitchen hoods. It's right in front of me. Okay, I didn't go out in the sand for 3 days in the sun and think through it, and nothing would have happened. So Kerzner, who's a great economist, Israel Kerzner, boils entrepreneurship down to alertness, paying attention, thinking, how would I do that? How could it be done differently? And the alertness is simply taking in information which causes you to think about a problem. If I was running a college, what would I do differently? Would I start with a football team, or would I start with great professors? We chose to start with great professors. I won't say that's unique, but to some degree it is, because if you look at the particularly Big Ten or many of these schools, they're sports academies first, and then yes, we hire some professors. It's secondary. So at Thales College, it's all about the professors and what they're going to teach you and what you're going to learn from your peers. There is no sports.
Well, and it's, in one sense, it's getting back to the heart of what that collegiate education was. I mean, we've changed so much over the last 200 years as an American culture that now I think the most radical thing we can do, and on a much smaller level even than a college is to have a family. That's now a radical thing to do. But then for a college, it's to actually structure the college to put the students interacting with the ideas that they're there to be shaped by through the teaching of the faculty, putting that front and center, making that the heart of the college, which is everything we do around here, and then try to create as many opportunities for our students to learn and to practice their skills, and then to go out and have excellent internship experiences in the world. But all of that really puts the student experience front and center, and it doesn't subsume the student experience to all these big flashy things that are kind of the norm in most colleges today.
Yeah, Thales College basically is a think tank, okay? We're learning how to think, we're taking in new knowledge. Eventually, the students go out, they're learning new things, they'll bring it back into the college. So it's a continuously learning, and learning is exciting. I mean, take a second grader, they learn how to read, they're excited. They're going to go and say, hey, Mom, I know how to read. We need to maintain that excitement throughout their entire lives. And when you have all these distractions, slowly you begin to lose that excitement for learning.
Well, Bob, thank you so much for coming on the show today and giving us some insight into the entrepreneurial mindset and into your work as an educational entrepreneur.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, and thank you, listeners and viewers, for joining me today here on The Optimistic Curmudgeon. My guest has been Bob Luddy, founder of CaptiveAire, Thales College, Thales Academy, St. Thomas More Academy, and Franklin Academy. We didn't really talk about them today, but Bob is also the author of The Thales Way and of An Entrepreneurial Life. We'll put links to both of those books in the show notes. Until next time, love the good, seek the true, and enjoy the beautiful.
Thank you for listening to Deep Leadership.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you for all you do.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. For more information and updates, please visit our website at www.deepleadershippodcast.com or johnsrennie.com. Until next time, take care.
Hi everyone, I'm Geraldine Glass, a leader in the field of music as medicine, and I'm excited to share with you my newest release of healing sound, Pentatonic Visions, with Chris Scholler and Electrocast Records. Immerse yourself in ethereal realms, where the harmonies of nature, tribal rhythms, and soundscapes blend with the crystal singing bowls. It's out now, streaming on all platforms.
Everyone has heard about the U.S. space program, but what is actually going on at NASA? Get the real story in 4 minutes or less with the NASA Daily podcast from Electrocast. Join astronauts and researchers as they conduct groundbreaking experiments, work on the International Space Station, and reach for the stars. NASA Daily, your cosmic update.
Electrocast.